All right, so this chapter also goes over eukaryotic cells. So here we're going to talk about eukaryotic cells and their structures. And this is less important in this chapter, but it's still important, and I'm counting on people being at least somewhat familiar. Eukaryotic cells are distinguished by having internal compartments. Like the nucleus. That's one of the key things. The name eukaryotic refers to the nucleus. And so they have these internal membranes and lots of them. And so it's just a second cell type, but they're larger, more complex cells found in different organisms. So last time I talked about cell theory. All living things are cells. Life processes come from cells. And my picture showed the two cell types. This is one of the great ideas of science, and it developed about the same time as the ideas around microbiology. And so it's kind of a core thing in biology that they often kind of overlook. Last time I went over the two basic types of cells, focusing on prokaryotic cells because those are new for most of us. These are bacteria and archaea. These cells are distinguished by having a rigid cell wall of either peptidoglycan or pseudomurin. That forms the kind of outer boundary of the cell and gives it its shape. Inside of that is the plasma membrane, which contains a single compartment full of cytoplasm and the DNA in a kind of a region called the nucleoid, but it's all really floating in the cytoplasm. All prokaryotic cells have ribosomes, which they use to make proteins. They may have a bunch of other stuff, sometimes important. If they do have a flagella, it's a rotating flagella. Okay, so here we're going to talk about eukaryotic cells. These are the large complex cells you find in plants, animals, fungi, and then single-celled eukaryotes like protists that are considered microbes. These cells are much larger. They share lots of features, even though they may look distinctly different. And we think of plants and animals as being kind of the opposite, but actually their cells are very similar. All eukaryotic cells have a nucleus. Okay, the nucleus contains their DNA in a separate compartment that's separated from the rest of the cell by a membrane. The nucleus is usually larger than a prokaryotic cells, and all eukaryotic cells have multiple chromosomes in their nucleus, at least two, sometimes many more than two, sometimes hundreds. The nucleus contains other structures like the nucleolus and nucleoplasm, and like the cell membrane of other cells, it has pores in it to control what goes in and out. The nucleus is the core difference between eukaryotes and prokaryotes. But there are other differences. One of the other differences is that in their cytoplasm, either floating free or attached to a membrane called the endoplasmic reticulum, eukaryotes have ribosomes that are larger than prokaryotes. These are called 80S ribosomes, and their subunits are 60S and 40S. They do the same thing, they make proteins, but they're larger and distinctly different. Eukaryotes also contain 70S ribosomes, but those are found in organelles like the chloroplasts of plants or the mitochondria. Since I mentioned the endomembrane system and endoplasmic reticulum, I should say something about this. It's a series of membranes that are often attached to the nucleus and provide for some spaces for the production of either proteins in the case of rough endoplasmic reticulum or lipids and carbohydrates in the case of smooth endoplasmic reticulum. In some cells, this is really extensive. It may fill the whole cell. And so like here, you see the nucleus, and then it's surrounded by membranes. This endomembrane system includes other membranes that are more distant from the nucleus, like the Golgi apparatus, and that makes vesicles. Less important, all this is less important than the differences with the nucleus, but still important. Another big difference is that eukaryotic cells have an internal protein skeleton transport system called the cytoskeleton. These proteins aren't found in prokaryotes, but they're extensively developed in eukaryotes. They include microtubules, actin, and intermediate filaments, and they determine the shape of these cells as much as or more than the presence or absence of cell walls. And they also allow these cells to move things internally and to change shape. These are extensive and they form other structures like cilia, centrioles, motor proteins, things like that. Mitosis, which many of us have learned in other classes, are really collections of cytoskeleton proteins that produce movement. Movements of cell membranes in forming vacuoles, that's because of cytoskeleton proteins being attached to the membrane. Okay, and so then another really important difference of these cytoskeleton proteins. A third difference that you find in all eukaryotic cells is the presence of mitochondria. Mitochondria contain the enzymes needed for aerobic metabolism. This is where eukaryotic cells use oxygen to break down carbohydrates, fats, and some amino acids to make carbon dioxide and release energy that's stored as ATP. Mitochondria have an outer membrane and an inner membrane, and these enzymes are often attached to that intermembrane. Mitochondria are found in plants and animals and all eukaryotes. They are abundant. The more active the cell is, the more common they're there. And they're very unusual as far as organelles go. Mitochondria have their own DNA. And like prokaryotic cells, they have a chromosome, a circular chromosome. And their mechanism of making new mitochondria is by binary fission, an identical process to prokaryotic cells. In addition, mitochondria have 70S ribosomes, just like bacteria. Many people have noticed these similarities, and I'll say more about this later. Okay. Similarly, in plants, but not in animals, not in fungi, we find chloroplasts. These also are membrane-enclosed structures that contain enzymes. But here the enzymes are used for photosynthesis. And that traps energy from sunlight to make carbohydrates. And in the process makes ATP. Chloroplasts also have their own chromosome, and they also have 70S ribosomes, and they also reproduce by binary fission, just like bacteria. Okay. After noticing all these similarities, some biologists have suggested that chloroplasts and mitochondria are really bacteria that have been engulfed by another cell, and they've come to live inside that cell and forming a partnership with the cell that engulfed them. So before they were organelles, these were free-living bacteria. In fact, we can find gene sequences in mitochondria and chloroplasts that allow us to identify which groups of bacteria they come from. This whole idea is called the endosymbiont theory, and it's well supported by evidence. Okay, I'm going to stop there. So eukaryotic cells are large complex cells, all containing a nucleus. They all contain ADS ribosomes, a cytoskeleton, and mitochondria. Some have an endomembrane system. Some have chloroplasts. They're the cells we find in multicellular organisms, animals, plants, fungi, and so on. One of the two basic cell types we think arose from a combination of a bunch of different prokaryotic cells getting together. All right, we'll stop there and we'll review next week.